The slave owners, we suggest, played an important part in the shaping of modern British society as agents, but also subjects of the New World. They have acted as a lens for us, pushing us to rethink the notion of the decline of the West India interest by the 1830s that became something of an orthodoxy following the work of both Ragaz and Williams. We have tracked the impact West Indian proprietors were able to have economically, politically, and culturally in the period after emancipation, and traced the continuities in the physical and cultural fabric of Britain. Far from surviving as an archaic fragment, with their political power demolished and their wealth undermined by emancipation, they were able to mobilize sufficient influence to secure major concessions in return for their acceptance of abolition. In addition to their share of the sum of 20 million, they also benefited substantially from the system of, quotes, apprenticeship, which meant that although formally free, those previously enslaved were compelled to work on the estates of their masters for a further period of 4 to 6 years. Since compensation marked the acceptance of the view that the institution of slavery had been legally and politically sanctioned by the state, and that the nation, British taxpayers, must bear the cost of the losses to the slave owners, those erstwhile slave owners saw no reason to assume individual guilt for the part they had played in maintaining the institution. Once abolition was enacted, they joined the chorus celebrating Britain's moral superiority and castigating other, less progressive, slave-owning nations. The absentee slave owners represented between 5 and 10% of the British elites between the 1810s and the 1860s. Many were linked in intricate networks of family and sociability. Unsurprisingly, family has proved crucial to our research, with marriage and inheritance as key mechanisms for the transmission of property. After emancipation, as Nick Draper has established, wealth continued to be created in the West Indies, particularly British Guiana, where owners successfully adapted to the new conditions of labour on their plantations. Many of the slave owners were not able to keep up with the sweeping changes in the British economy associated with the explosion of overseas trade, the so-called swing to the east, the investment in the new colonies of white settlement, the consolidation of the City of London as the centre of global capital flows, the emergence of the joint stock company, new systems of communication, and the birth of the free trade nation. But many others adapted to this new world order, selling their plantations, transferring human and financial capital generated in slavery to the new industrial and commercial economy, contributing significantly to the growth of merchant banking and investment in marine insurance and railways. The decline of British proprietorship in the West Indies is thus a neglected aspect of the shift from land to commerce and industry that was a feature of this mid-19th century period. The abolition of slavery meant a shift in the balance of empire. The British West Indies, especially Jamaica, once the jewel in the crown, became increasingly defined as problematic and unproductive. Attention shifted to India and the East and to the new colonies of white settlement. Younger sons who had headed for the Caribbean now found their opportunities in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa. Henry Kingsley abandoned his family's long-term interest in Barbados and chose New South Wales for his unsuccessful colonial careering. Compensation money flowed into new ventures such as the Australian Agricultural Company and the development of South Australia and British Columbia. The Caribbean was no longer seen as a place to make a fortune and was neglected, sidelined in favour of more wealth-producing economies. Slavery was something to be regretted and forgotten, expunged insofar as was possible from public memory. After 1833, the West Indians were able to leave behind the identity of slave owner and sought to ensure their place in the reconfiguration of the ruling elite, which was part and parcel of the age of reform, determinedly not part of a residual formation in a time of realignment when emergent groupings were claiming dominance. They declared themselves as modern men, part of the new world. Between 1828 and 33, new rights for dissenters, Catholic emancipation, parliamentary reform, a coercion act for Ireland, the abolition of slavery, and new forms of government for India together marked a historic settlement across nation and empire. A new hegemony was in process, dependent on an alliance between the landed aristocracy and sections of the middle class, committed to an expansion of laissez-faire and a reforming state. Government was to be by consent, if possible, at home, reliant on force and dominion in the empire, including Ireland. In the metropole, public opinion had an increased weight, with the power of the press increasing rapidly, and more meritocratic systems of appointment began to slowly displace the patronage that had operated for generations. Slave owners and their descendants were more likely to be Tories than Whigs, but they belonged to the elite which affected these changes and sometimes benefited from them. William Gladstone and Henry Goulburn in the House of Commons, Charles Trevelyan in the expanding colonial and civil service, Cardinal Manning in the resurgent Catholic Church, Captain Frederick Marriott and Charles Kingsley, authors who were amongst the first generation to be able to make a substantial income from writing, were just some of the many former slave owners or their descendants who established themselves as influential men in the reconfigured public world. At the same time, as Keith McClelland has demonstrated, those members of the West India interest who remained in Parliament fought hard on the issues of apprenticeship, the retention of protection for West Indian sugar, and the introduction of indenture. They lost on the first two, though they were able to delay the equalisation of duties for a significant period. They were successful, however, in representing Labour as the problem at the heart of the economic and social issues in the Caribbean, and indeed in representing themselves as the victims of economic decline. Some of the slave owners, most notably John Gladstone, William's father, had seen the writing on the wall and had started to reorganise their estates before 1833. Gladstone's efforts to inaugurate the use of Indian indentured labour on his Guyanese estates had limited success in the 1820s, but were to provide one of the bases for the large-scale adoption of the system by the 1840s. The former slave owners' insistence on the need for new labour was a key factor in the institutionalisation of new forms of coerced labour in the empire, facilitated by the liberal state, which was also busy regulating labour at home through the New Poor Law and Factory Acts. Slave owners and their descendants were also active agents in the remaking of race as a hierarchical category. Once slavery no longer fixed the African as inferior, other legitimations for his or her subordination had to be found. In the debates over race in the mid-19th century and the shift from the ascendancy of abolitionist humanitarian discourse to a harsher version of stadial theory, envisioning the civilizational process as glacially slow, historians, novelists, and travel writers with slave-owning origins played a significant part. They utilized their eyewitness experience to make claims as to the veracity of their characterizations of racial difference. In the process, they also rewrote the history of British involvement in colonial slavery. The Marriott family provide a brief case study exemplifying some of these general processes that I've been talking about. They defended slavery till the last possible moment and then adapted to the new times. Slavery might be dead and forgotten, but racial hierarchies lived on. While engaging with groups around the country who've been interested in our work, we have been asked again and again for material on the slave owners in the period before emancipation. our new project, The Structure and Significance of British Caribbean Slave Ownership, 1763 to 1833, takes up this challenge thanks to a grant from the ESRC and the AHRC. We have been fortunate in adding Christy Warren, James Dawkins, Hannah Young, and Katie Donington again to our existing team. We have set ourselves an ambitious target to systematically analyse slave ownership and its consequences for Britain across that period. We will establish patterns of ownership across the 4,000 plus estates and its consequences for the development of Britain. This time, the sources we are using will enable us to collect material on the lives of the enslaved. Once again, our data will be made publicly available so that by 2016 we should be able to provide a spectacular research tool in our encyclopedia. Our particular focus as a research team will be on the absentees and their legacies, once again, tracing their commercial, political and cultural presence and impact on Britain, and allowing us to re-examine the relationship between slavery, empire and the early imperial nation. The encyclopedia opens up innumerable research possibilities for the descendants of both the enslavers and the enslaved, demonstrating the connected history that we share, albeit always embedded in unequal relations of power. This is the new past that we are aiming for, a past which reinscribes slavery and slave ownership in British history and recognises its legacies in the present. Thank you.